You know how a place that is your home or a place very important to you, there are certain key images that kind of, at least for me, just fix it in your head. And it's because of Leabhair, who started the story, and this man here, John Gray, that I have a very firm image of Belfast. It wasn't my first visit, but it was very early on. I think the first day I was with Liz on the storytelling program all those years ago in the early 80s, she introduced me to things that are quintessentially Belfast in my mind. Cave Hill, Samson and Goliath, the Harlan and Wolf, St. George's Market, and the Linen Hall Library. And most of those she introduced me to through this man before I met him, because she gave me, the first book she gave me was The Day the Monster Came. Great book, great book. And so, although we haven't seen each other very often over the years, more now that I've moved back over here to Belfast now to live, but that was my image of Belfast all the time, you know, before, never mind what I had before when I was living in America or studying in England. It was those images of Cave Hill and the Harlan and Wolff cranes and the Linen Hall, and largely because of John's books, the other books that he wrote. And I think it's that way for those people who had access to those books in those days. It's still that for lots of people as children. It was just they just captured Belfast. Our first speaker for this section, John Gray, I asked along because at some point, I can't remember when we were talking, and he got on, he had a new book, and I think you asked me, you said you wanted it to be in Irish as well. Did I know anyone? And I think I put you on to Andrew and Christina then. Yeah, that's right. And then they put you on to Anton. And so... And so it seemed to make sense to have the three of them together again. And Katrina is very sorry she can't be here today, but I'm going to kind of take her place in as a very poor substitute. But anyway, John Gray, for those who don't know, I think most people who do, he was for a long time the librarian of the Linen Hall Library, very important cultural institution here in the north of Ireland, for all of Ireland, really. Great history, if you don't know it. Also very active in the community, has been arguing and advocating for the restoration of the assembly halls here in Belfast, the assembly rooms. The assembly rooms here in Belfast, which are very historic and important, but in danger. Also running Regain the Enlightenment, which is sponsors wonderful festivals and publications. And so I asked John to start this session off. I'm going to talk to him about these books we've been mentioning and how they came about and why. So, John, do you want to start out? Why did you start writing children's books when you were writing for grown-ups and doing all this work in the library?
Well, actually, I wrote children's books before I sort of went off into the rarefied and boring world of adult non-fiction. And the reason was, and it's a nice coincidence that Liz Weir is here today. The reason is that in about 1977, roughly speaking, I was appointed as branch librarian at Ballymacarrat Branch Library, 3 streets down from here. And lo and behold, at that time, Liz was running the Public Library Services Children's Service from the upper floors of the branch library. Now, Liz didn't actually inspire me to start writing children's stories, but she was very important in the process. I mean, what happened was, you know, as a father, I had told my children bedtime stories of an entirely inconsequential kind, which I subsequently tried to remember what these stories were and couldn't remember them. But thrown into Ballymacarrat Branch Library, and you have to remember that this is, you know, inner city Belfast, a very deprived area, also with serious sectarian divisions. And, you know, this was a failing branch library. It had virtually no customers. And I had to ask myself, you know, what on earth do we do to rescue this situation? And the place was running with children who had nowhere to go and nothing to do, and were engaged in various kinds of petty vandalism and whatever. So what do? You start children's story time, right? And children's story time gets bigger and bigger. And you get fed up with telling children from Ballymacarrat stories about princes and princesses and fairy queens and things that had absolutely nothing to do with their experience or with where they lived. So I thought, well, you know, surely I'll have a stab at doing something better. And the first stab was this: the day the monster came. Well, so what do? We've already mentioned the shipyard cranes. Well, they've got to be part of the story. You know, they're absolutely ever present in this area, looming over everything. And the shipyard is very important. The shipyard was still on the go then. So what do we do next? We have a big storm which wakes up an enormous monster under the sea, and the monster staggers ashore, and it's got a tickle on its back. And so what does it do? It heads for the cranes and starts scratching its back on the cranes, and the whole of Ballymacarrat starts shaking up and down. And then, you know, a little bit of sort of current politics. Well, the respective paramilitaries come out and start shooting at it, which just enrages the monster, and it jumps up and more. And then the army turns up and says, we've got tanks and we can deal with this monster. And so they fire at the monster, but to no effect, it jumps up and down even more. And then the heroines of the story are two little girls who go to the library and read about monsters and prehistoric monsters and reckon it's a vegetarian. And they've got relatives who work in the fruit market. And so they arrange to get a lorry load of fruit brought up. And the monster stops jumping up and down, eats the fruit, and happily goes off to sea again. And, okay, that's that story. And it was Liz who really encouraged me to go ahead with it. And it was subsequently published by Apple Tree Press, and a dramatized version was done for BBC Radio. And then I did a second story, which was about a little boy who was unhappy and lived in a rather house-proud home where he wasn't allowed any pets. He was his only child. The man in the corner shop, you know, says, oh, he's complaining to the man in the corner shop, and the man says, well, what you need is a dragon. And so where do you get a dragon? Well, you go to Smithfield Market. Now, unfortunately, Smithfield Market got burned down a number of years later, but that was where you went for pet shops and all that sort of thing. And sure enough, he finds a sort of magic shop where he gets a dragon in a sort of matchbox. It's only that size. And of course, then he's in control of the situation from then on. I mean, the dragon jumps out of the matchbox, and his mother has hysterics, and you know, everybody is sort of absolutely alarmed by the dragon, and the dragon eats coal and gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And then the little boy reckons that he'll get the dragon to deal with the nasty boys who have bullied him, but actually the dragon simply flies away, and he goes back to the corner shop in a great state of distress, and says to the old man in the corner shop, what's happened? My dragon's gone away. And the man in the corner shop says, you only have a dragon as long as you need it. You can't have a dragon in order to bully other people. That's the end of the story. Well, that got published by Apple Tree as well. So then, a huge gap. And of course, it was because the moment I stopped working with children, the inspiration went. And I was running the Linen Hall Library and doing all sorts of boring adult things. And, then, a couple of years ago, I suppose I started entering my second childhood. And it did. I live up the Antrim Road, as I discover, like our Afghan friends here today. We live 5 minutes apart, apparently. And of course, the Cave Hill looms above the Antrim Road. Indeed, has been my great place of relief over the years. Every time I got fed up with the city, I could climb Cave Hill and piss on it. And I have been a critic of the zoo, and I'm uncomfortable with zoos, and in particular, I'm uncomfortable with the Belfast Zoo. And that has I've written things about it and made noises of an adult kind. But then a red panda escaped a couple of years ago from the zoo. And I just thought, well, why did it escape? I mean, they fed it, didn't they? Why would it escape? And just on one night, I think I was stuck on some awful adult screed I was trying to write. And I thought, well, just in one night, I thought, well, okay, why did it escape? Surely there's a story there. And in one night, I wrote what in English is Red Panda's Great Escape, and there's the Irish version. And just to say a word or two about the story, well, it does start with, how did the red pandas end up in the zoo? And, there's a story of their kidnapping in the jungles of Nepal or wherever. Ostensibly, and the parents argue about whose fault it was. It was because you were tempted by the bananas that the hunter laid out for you. So, you're into a parental squabble, first of all, but they're saying, look, it's okay here. We get fed, and they say it's very good for us. And the little red panda is not sure at all. And the little red panda is also very bored. They're in an enclosure. Now here's, you're picking on a familiar thing with small children. I'm bored, Well, if you're a red panda in a zoo enclosure, and your mother says, well, look, just try walking around the enclosure another 3 times or climb the one tree. Well, he still says he's bored. And then he's looking up to the forests and the hill and thinking, there's a kind of subliminal feeling that he ought, he ought to be able to go out there. And one moonlight night, there's a big gale and a tree falls and breaks down the fence to the enclosure, and he escapes. And so there's a theme there, you know, running away from home. That's effectively what he's doing. And one sort of subliminal message in this story is that you should think very carefully before you run away from home, because on the hill, for a start, he's used to a diet of bamboo and bananas, but there aren't any bamboos and bananas on the cave hill, and a friendly badger offers him slugs and snails and worms, and friendly rabbits offer him grass, and, you know, none of it suits him. And then, you know, there are other things that the animals on the hill, some of them don't like immigrants, right? They don't like strangers, and are inclined to eat them. And indeed, you know, there's a nefarious group which includes a fox, a magpie, and a rat who try to eat him for lunch. And then there's a group of boys who go hunting with dogs on the hill, and I'm glad to say they get their comeuppance. And so on and so forth. There are various, I mean, I don't put the moral bits of this story up front. They are kind of subtext. And eventually, yes, in pursuit of bamboos, he breaks into one of the gardens fronting the cave hill and thinks maybe these flowers will be nice to eat. One of them is a rose bush, and of course that is not nice to eat at all. And the people in the house panic, or the parents do, and think it's a dangerous wild animal, but the daughter in the house has more sense. And eventually he ends up back in the zoo. So, end of story. I was pretty pleased with it. The following day, thought, well, I'll tell you what, I'll publish this myself, because I had experience of publishing pamphlets, of these adult pamphlets that I'm talking about. And then the next thing was, I need an illustrator. I mean, you know, children's books, it's 50-50. I mean, the illustrator is really at least as important as the author. Well, if the story itself is no good, the whole thing will go down the tube. But the story can be excellent, and if the illustrator is rotten, it's not going anywhere. I was very fortunate. After a couple of false alleys, just across the street from me, I found an absolutely brilliant illustrator, a girl called Beth McComish. Hang on to that for a second. Sorry, we should have done slides, but I just sort of... Oh yeah, this is the red panda. The rabbits have advised him he might slip. And Red Panda says, pandas don't slip. And then on the next page, this is what happens. Let's see, what else have we got here? Oh yes, this is what happens. These are the boys with the hunting dog. And you can see that one of the boys has climbed the tree, and the red panda's up the top of the tree, and the branch breaks, and the boy falls on top of the dog, which then proceeds to bite him, and so on and so forth. And then the next thing was...
I was going to say, and then when did you decide that you wanted the book to be in Irish as well?
Well, it was Beth who really convinced me. Now, I already, despite my woeful ignorance of the Irish language, I wish I was as good a linguist as my son, who is fluent in Irish. But I am a supporter of, and have been, a supporter of the rights of the Irish language. I have, I've quite a number of friends who don't have Irish, but have sent their children to Irish language schools. And, you know, I was aware that the whole thing was developing pretty fast. And Beth's a very good example of it. Beth is actually English. She's married to a guy from West Belfast, and they are sending their children to a Bumscoil, and Beth is learning Irish herself. And she said, well, why don't you publish an Irish language edition? And I mean, I was easily persuaded. I mean, and everything that has happened since has convinced me that it was the right thing to do. I mean, after all, there are now, I think, something like 7,000 children being educated in Irish in Belfast. I mean, curiously, you know, while I think it's arguable that the language is near death in the west of Ireland, however much one tries to preserve it there, it is enjoying an extraordinary revival in this city. And wherever children are, if there is an Irish language community, they deserve to have children's books in their language. So the next thing was, where do I find a translator? And I got the best of advice. And Anton, who's here today, did the job. Now, I can't judge whether he did a good job. So, Anton, you got a sort of a free run there. But I did ask quite a few people what they thought of the translation. In particular, my friend Cormac Hamill, who is a well-known Irish language broadcaster and maker of television programs in Irish, etc. Clean bill of health from Cormac. That was good enough for me. So there we are.
And this is where we're going to bring Anton McLaughlin in, who did a very good job with John's book, but also the reason I and others wanted to include him today, he's also well known for having translated The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe into Irish, which is by a local boy, as we know. C.S. Lewis Square is just down the road. If any of you haven't been to this part of Belfast before, you might want to have a look after the day or during the lunch break. And also, just from those of us interested in children's books, Anton also has translated the Asterix books into Irish. So I just thought, well, this is someone that iBbY definitely needs to hear from. So Anton McLaughlin now is going to do a bit more formal presentation of how the book turned into Irish, basically.
Good morning. I was just thinking, John, it's no wonder Smithfield Market burned down if they were selling dragons in it. You know, the severe lapse in health and safety there. Dear Patrick Adam, an honest knowledge Gaelic agus the Berlin, agus sin rud Janasma, agus Janama Moyihel, Frastel ar da, chuid Sadois, but Jerem rud in the Helam hen of a Tawach, Stolm Gamesh le Clension Sada Hanga. So I'll try to equally kind of cover both languages today. You can see from my bog standard 1990s PowerPoint presentation that I haven't really got great skills in this, but it'll be enlivened by some of the illustrations from the books. So, by Bisha Kant Coach Warren you the Dulline when in the Shanastrachan. Agus Estolum Ganyanama Shinigo Hicks and the Tiert and the Esog. I'll be talking mostly today about challenges in translation and some of the kind of solutions that translators find in the context of the books for your younger readers that I've translated. An chéadrod báile me lua na faibanna astrachan, agus hocalat a ra beidir gur faib tan ahan ocal a bís le haster agad. Translation problems, you could say, every word you have to translate is a problem in a way. But there are more specific, that word is used in a more specific sense for ruddy ata in the text berla, no the text Frankische, no kbikade. Agus ní leor an gra chor heige astrachan le iad the hortslan sa gaelige. Cai tú sheft eigen na capu, cai tú balach eilige eigen na amshu. Translation problems are usually things that you just can't use the normal translation process. It's not as if there's one set of words in English and another set of words in Irish. There are obstacles that we've overcome, and you have to come up with some sort of solution to them. And yeah, so sin faibanna astrachan. Agus an chéad cean acu beidir in ar bhiste flé na tagartí cultúrtha. Rud atá deanta renew sin ar maidin fast a bhí cantar sin ar a bhí garden the chuirsí ser ra bhéalachan in the low agad. Cultural references Gordon has alluded to already when he was talking about you can't carry two melons in one hand. You know, that's not an image that's likely to be very familiar to Irish speakers, for example. And John, the title of John's book, not to go on even further than the title, posed that kind of problem of a cultural reference, because when I say The Great Escape, what do you think of? The film, yeah, the film with Steve McQueen on his motorbike, going across a barbed wire fence, I think, on it. And even if John hadn't actually had that film in mind when he wrote The Great Escape, when he used that term, Great Escape is a thing in English because of that film. So even if you see a news report of sort of crowded scenes at an airport, everyone trying to get away on holiday after COVID, and the headline will be The Great Escape, or a football team is 2-0 down with 5 minutes to go, and they score 3 goals in 5 minutes, and it'll be The Great Escape headline. Even if they're not referring to the film, Tan Great Escape sa verla Marial ar a Skainos sin. So it's not as if there's a problem actually translating the words. Élu, escape, great, more, and Télu, more. Élu, more, and Fandarua. Ach yn neidir at sin falf, níl bhrí, níl iwa, a muscult, and san hanshin. That would actually be, a literal translation there would be a very poor thing, because The Great Escape doesn't exist in Irish. We had great escapes, you know, I'm thinking of E. O'Donnell escaping from Dublin Castle and going off across the wintry landscape, across the Wicklow Mountains and all, but we don't call that in Télu Mór. So, Gajé Ramafushin. Bhín aistrathirí account cúitimh, agus sin rud atá geisteach le sin bhín a gcónaí cailtna san aistrachan, cailte rud éigean. Ní hé go bhfuil forann focail amháin ar thaobh amháin agus forann focail eile agus gneantar an taistrú, slán, go hilas go hiomlán. There's always some sort of loss involved in translation, and you have to compensate as best you can. So in this case, I just tried to do it with the rhythm of the language, and Pandorua a daily unzu. It's a bit kind of sing-song. It's a bit like a sort of Shakespeare line. Not comparing myself to Shakespeare, by the way, but you know that sort of iambic pentameter, to be or not to be, and Pandorua a daily unzu. And Roa has a nice kind of almost rhyme with zoo. So it's dóthe fasta Norton sé tilú den scale. It actually gives away more of the story than John's own title does. But a panda Roa escaping from the zoo is exactly the kind of thing that got John hooked in the first place. That was the kind of the hook that he inspired him to go on and write the whole book. Emeritus focal, no wordplay. Well, it's a good rudig in a point le fuam na wakel in Severland that tigla the hortslan sa gailge. So the John Kershey's Hannah Fain an artra show ta an pandorua ta shamwi ta shinye elu on zoo agus caster lesh na hanvihe ele show madurua no shonach agus lohogwar agus snag brak no magpie. So he's meeting all these strange characters. And they're talking a lot about food. Lunch, said the fox. Munch, said the rat. Crunch, croaked the magpie. And of course, the panda realizes after a short while that they're actually talking about him because he doesn't see them carrying any food. He is the one who's about to be munched. He is the one who's about to be crunched, and he is going to be lunch. So, you know, níl trí acal sa gaeilge a bheith ar ein chéal le sin, so tá sé antachar freastal ar sin. So, bia san sionnach, bia blasta san lethag mhór, bia gasta san snag brach go piachanach. Food, said the fox. Tasty food, said the rat. Fast food, said the magpie in a croaky voice. So, ní astrahan fácla rockla seo, ní astrahan literal, a ríist is cinnal cuairtifatan na geri cinnal frastal an grand vis verla. This is all a translator can do is, there was no point trying to produce a kind of literal translation of that. You just have to compensate the best you can. So that adds something that wasn't in the original. And, you know, there's no mention of fast food in the original. But, you know, it isn't a bad idea because... Well, it is fast food because he's right in front of them and he's just about to get eaten, I suppose. So, you know, it might have been a bit cheeky, but John didn't know any better anyway, so I got away with it. Yeah. Tá an Pandorua na Pali in Tanyamata Castar slua Kunyini. Agus Tuggin Shid Kuru, da Honve Suguru law, Agus Jershid. Would you like to play hippity hop? Said one. Would you like to play hoppity hip? Said another. Would you like to play jumpity jump? Said a third one. No, Arisht. Ta immertas fakal the gestin shaw, ta foam the wackle, ta rihim the wackle. You'd have to say maybe some of these words aren't very loaded in terms of their semantic content. They don't actually mean an awful lot, but you know, they're musical and they're sing-song and they're very lively and very imaginative use of language. So, and réiteachar sin, yeah. Well, to a geri chart the lemni as a lubulin sa cianacu, no a prabu as a pramsal sa cianele, no a skipal as a skjaru sin trihu cian. These are all examples of alliteration, and we had that earlier this morning too with is Kashmir, Dachach, a chanter hain, everyone. Own area is their own Kashmir, so k. And this, I think, is probably the ornamentation par excellence in the Irish language. We're sort of addicted to alliteration in Irish. We have these kind of little doublets that we use an awful lot in speech. If you're fed up, do daite. If you're kind of very tired, tatu tarsha trerte. If you're very worried about something, tatu krate kiapa, and all these type of things. So we use that an awful lot. And if you want something to actually sound like Irish, I always think, you know, you wouldn't do far wrong by using alliteration. And as a matter of fact, the alliteration is even increased in this, even beyond what John had, because, you know, you can see that the second line there, the Kunyini export is expri, and they eat grass, and the grass is described as fair ur aling and fair glas galanta. So there's even more alliteration, you know. So some rabbits get maximatosis, and these ones have got alliterationitis, no the conversion. I would suggest actually it's not a bad idea using alliteration in a translation, even when there is no translation problem to be solved. It's just such a fundamental thing in the Irish language. Now, Shaw Pector o Leor Will Katrina agus Andrew Goberer. This is actually a pity now that Katrina and Andrew from the publishers on Tranlsating aren't with us, because this is their current project, a translation of a book by Charlie Mackesy. I always get the sequence of this wrong. The boy, the horse, the fox, and the mole, I think. Agus, it's co-astra hanaton mar she mar is F, agus ma hen at kinal goberli hele an astrahan. So the Michelle Cantor Mohan hen yma Carfakla and Mail Wyron show. But even though this doesn't look like a very serious translation problem when you look at it, this book, by the way, I should say, is actually a very nice book. It's actually a kind of book, but it's all about sort of self-confidence and acceptance and just accepting who you are and not comparing yourself to others. It's a very healthy kind of message in this book. And this boy meets this mole, small little animal, and the mole says, "I'm so small," said the mole. "Yes," said the boy, "but you make a huge difference." Now, that doesn't really seem as if it's going to be really hard to translate. And you could indeed translate it literally. But there's a thing with that "I'm so small." People who have learned Irish have a tendency to use the word "cho" there, which means as. So if they say, "Oh my God, it's so cold," they'll say "Tá sé cho fuair," with that type of emphasis. And it's one of those things that's so actually established now, there's probably no point giving out about it anymore. But it's not very native to do that, to use that type of language. Obviously, there's something going on in that sentence there. There's a need for some sort of what you might call an intensifier. There's a need to actually up the speech and show how small the thing is, how big the other thing is. And Gaelic, Tymisha beg buitach san chéachan. I'm so small. The emphasis is got across by the alliteration. I'm not only bag, I'm buitach as well. You know, it's sort of like it's a sort of double whammy. Tymisha beg buitach san chéachan, te san bochel. A janin to differ more miltach. We would have preferred differ more miltach there, but we had to watch the character count. So that's what we got. So that's how the contrast is made there between the two things. Beg buitach, more miltach. I think it's something just very kind of, it just works somehow. Alliteration is no mar a German Gaelic sin and canal orna diart Gaelige par excellence. Being five in a gyminic, there have been two kinds of Ashter hand Jardini. Well, it's kind of be in Tashter hand Jlihul, no in Tashter hand canal technical and rudder stacker or fad. Ach, need all good be. There's a sort of misunderstanding that technical translation or legal translation is the real killer. You know, that's what you really need to be, you're training for. In a way, that's not really true. Sometimes it's just the ordinary words that actually trip you up, because ordinary words have kind of connotations and echoes. Machali stare agus radiella onto. A richt gan gal needs for Janan Chidil, in the serie show, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Now, the Rahama had a trade, agus the Gurha Keshtarini, kin gailge at her witch. The stylum bonus nanini gerachib kailach, gershin and focal gaeliger witch. That would be the most common translation of the word. If you asked anyone in an Irish language school, what's the word for a witch? Kailach. But, the faibon. Fekin Shivinshin and San Vinu in Snocklor. You might be surprised to see the first word there being a nun, by the way. But that's just a reference to Kaila is an old word for a veil. So Kailach was a veiled woman. So that's how it came to mean a nun. But the second meaning there is an old woman, a hag. Now, this is from a very shameful part of history where, marginalized women were killed in their tens of thousands and hunted in the witch hunts. And obviously, it was a very unhealthy idea that at the time, they made this sort of appalling kind of judgment on people who looked differently, that there was some sort of, their alleged unsightliness was something to do with some sort of internal corruption or whatever. A very dark episode in history, but it does leave us with a problem, because there is this perception, when you say the word Kailach, that you're talking about some sort of, physical, this person is not judged to be aesthetically pleasing by whatever standards there were at the time. But that's not really the case in the case of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. She was a great lady. Sean Theodore, this is the first time she appears in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Taller than any woman that Edmund had ever seen. She was also covered in white fur up to her throat and held a long, straight golden wand in her right hand and wore a golden crown on her head. Her face was white, not merely pale, but white like snow or paper or icing sugar, except for her very red mouth. It was a beautiful face in other respects, but proud and cold and stern. So, Neil and Focal Kailach, first nach an shower Caribbe, just ni hoku Kailach a hartari. She done Tilda Swinton, around Parchiniki and Scannon. Tilda Swinton played this part in the film, and it just doesn't seem an apt word. When I was up earlier in C.S. Lewis Square, there's actually a statue of the White Witch, and the word that's used to describe her there is a cross between a giant and a genie, which is, again, wouldn't be a cailleach. That wouldn't be the right word either. So what do you do? Well, tranlsating drí on. Now, there's an unfortunate translation of that druid, which might kind of sum up images of sort of men who should know better, right? Sort of wearing white hoods and walking around Stonehenge chanting or something. But drí, it just sort of means anyone who's involved in witchcraft, no dríart, not a dig immersion. So, we must mean alum, yeah, shin kurshis mai an wanrian. And so, hogmuj an tidil shaw an Leor, an Leon, an bandri agus an presedi. I should say a word about that prefix bandri. There's a move away from using that prefix ban now in front of words. It's considered kind of demeaning, if someone is a guard, they're a guard, and you don't call them bangardi anymore. That's sort of, another common word was banaltra, a nurse, which just assumed that all nurses are women, and seemed sort of slightly, demeaning. I know it's not an even thing, this. I know for a fact, for example, that Nolan O'Connell, the poet, she doesn't mind actually being called a banille, a female poet. She thinks it's actually important that that word appears there. But she hates the English poetess. She thinks poetess is patronizing and should prefer to avoid it. I kind of thought that Galore Tower the point le ban in Sachas show, so shouldn't tidil a washed majer. Becomes by done fi presedi faste, maar te fakkel an vardrus in jeskert netere ach near hola mario o vel in den jubioa, so near usad mai. Yeah, anyam yaha agus las anyam yaha. Bin five agoni le shaw. It's a very tricky part of translation because very often you're dealing with things that aren't really words, but still express something. So there's a giant in the Line of Witch in the wardrobe called Rumblebuffin. Now, we're pretty useless going to the dictionary looking for a definition of Rumblebuffin, but that doesn't mean to say it's completely meaningless. Mas fahachatan by an talawar kri fina chasa. If he's a giant, he'll probably make the ground rumble when he walks. Buffin is kind of evocative of ruffian or bumpkin. Rodegen mershin, then you garav, then you can nachwalin to shidul and a doini. So, could you yan into the rumble buffin? Mas can ruddy beter. Class kachinte at hogin, there be much a play la fakal mershaw na transliteration. In other words, spell out the word as it would be spelled if it were in Irish. So that's where we get a lot of our terminology from. Telefish, organ, ruddy mershin is transliteruvinig echt. But there was a problem here as well with giant rumblebuffin and tiny bata because but to rumblebuffin fahach Parodigan canal ashtach we it's almost like a business card or something, I'm rumblebuffin giant. It's Rodigan canal ashtach we. So kete yan into le shin hudson danakal giant. Processella fad a doctor duchasu no naturalization. That's when you take something that's in the culture of the original and you try to match it up with something that's in the culture of the language you're translating into. I saw a very good example of this recently. Somebody was referred to as a aging Lothario. Lothario. It's not a word you hear an awful lot anymore, but it's sort of, a kind of would-be ladies' man, I suppose, or something like that. And I thought it was Shakespearean, but it's actually later than that. It crops up in a play called The Reluctant Penitent or something like that. So what do you do with Lothario? In the Finn McCool stories, there's a character called Diarmuid O'Divna, and Diarmuid has got a ball shertke. He's got a sort of mark on his face that when women see it, they just can't help but fall in love with him. So in this translation, this isn't self-praise because it wasn't me who translated it, but Lothario was translated with Diarmuid. So that's an example of Duchasu, which is very good, I think. So I was just sort of thinking of the Galway name Fahi or O'Fahi. So sin an taine mo thug muid a rumble buffin sa deirú, rumble buffin O'Fahi. Agus tá an fahach istíon, tá rumble buffin istíon. Sin rud a rumid leis. Sample eile den rud seo Duchasu bhfuil me caintear. Rumble buffin, tógann se carabud nor a dégin den talú. I don't know what object it is that rumble buffin lifts, but the description in the book is, it was only about the same size to him that a saccharin tablet would be to you. Now, that's kind of a bit of its time, even, I think. A saccharin tablet, rud bag bhuidach, gan auras, sin rud atá gist, ach, tablet siúcrín. You know, it doesn't evoke anything. It doesn't have any kind of echoes in the Irish language. It's just a strange piece of vocabulary. So, and dáir hasriú sin ní raibh sé dhéanamh smó na should, na mar raibh pishan at the louse. It was no bigger in his hand than a little pea, a tiny pea would be in yours. So, you know, this is rudbeg dama, you know, tá muid gahrú na wacail seo agus a siadam gomininic ní bhíonn an darna ré on, there's no better thing for it. I'll just finish up by saying a lot of what I've been talking about is about kind of normalizing the text for Irish language readers. If Irish language readers read something like tablet, siúcrín, you know, they're going to get a bit of a kind of shock, and you don't want them to. You want them to read this thing. Quite often people say that the whole point of translation is to produce something that is like it was written in Irish in the first place. Yes, that's true, but there's moderation in all things. Tá massar ar a hanrod. Sometimes writers have a strangeness about them and a kind of freshness about them. And it would be unfair to the author, I think, to just do this kind of wholesale kind of normalization, Gaelicization on their writing. Now, Charlie Mackesy is one of these people. And one of the pictures from the book there, the mole is a great font of knowledge. He says, being kind to yourself is one of the greatest kindnesses. Now, tá sin rubag neu grafio wain sa verla. You know, ní bheith hasú le habert mar sin, tá sin rubag aisteach. A bheith cinálta de tain, sin ceann na cináltais is mó ar fad sin cuachan. Now, we don't, in the Irish language, tend to put abstract nouns in the plural. You know, if you're talking about your hopes and dreams, you don't say, mo rochish agus ma ashlingi na rodege mar sin, you know, deirtu ma chuid na rodí bhfuil ma súil lá na. You come up with some sort of formula rather than avoid putting it in the plural like that. But sin gedíra han rud atá danto go man sin. Agus tá sé aisteach, agus tá sé rubag neograch. But I think it is a bit unusual, but I think I got away with it. And I think it kind of, one of the things we have to bear in mind is that literature for children has to be a bit unusual, has to be removed from mundane language to some extent. So there's a danger in trying to normalize everything. You know, sometimes you should just leave a little bit of room for something kind of weird and wonderful. Agus sin bhfuil ar agamsa.
Anton. I enjoyed that very much. I hope all you did. We have a little bit of time for questions, I think. One comment, what you remind me of, and I'd forgotten, I thought of it long ago when I was planning it. Those of you who've been to iBbY conferences may know of an Irish woman and translator, Emer O'Sullivan. She doesn't translate into Irish, but she translates into many other languages and is an academic. And I've seen her do exercises where maybe get 2 or 3 people translating the same passage, and it really is a creative process. It's really art, because it doesn't all come out the same way. And you've given us, I think, some insight to that today. Any question or comment right now for John or Anton at all about the stories and the whole process of translation? No.
I'm just now reading, I'm reading the second of your translations, the C.S. Lewis ones, and I just love your work. So it really make it very, very enjoyable. Thanks so much.
I have to tell you, for the Writers in Schools program last year, I was at a school up in West Belfast, and the project is Our Place. That's the theme when we do a residency right now. And so I got the idea, talking to the teacher, of we'd done it before in the school, and so we thought rather than just take local buildings and parks and things, I said, what if we take some books by writers who are local, who are inspired by the locality? And so I had copies of John's books, and I had The Magician's Nephew, I had a children's version of Gulliver's Travel, I had Myra's books of Rita, and who else did we have? And the kids looked at these, and we looked at how Cave Hill may have inspired the image of Gulliver and the little people around them, and how John's books, mentioned places the kids knew, like the shipyard and the cranes, and they absolutely loved it, and they created their own stories from that. And although it was St. Teresa School, so they don't teach Irish, I did bring Irish versions of the books for the kids to look at, and they were fascinated with that. So I think there's a lot that you mentioned there that as educators too, I think there's a place, even if the children haven't grasped another language yet, there's so much they get from it, I think, when we bring these books and things together. We'll finish up the morning there. Lunch should be around the corner. If you ordered lunch, those of you who registered, it'll be there for you. If anyone was going to do their own lunch, if you go out and to the right, down towards Collins Water and C.S. Lewis Square, there's places you can get a bite to eat there. We'll start back in again at 1:30. Again, for those who don't know this neighborhood, if you've come up and you've not visited this part of Belfast before, the C.S. Lewis Square is about a 5-10 minute walk away. It's a real delight. It's one of the things I think people in Belfast are proud of over the years, one of our kind of new sites to see. So if you want to get some pictures of yourself for being next to the C.S. Lewis characters, they're down there. And of course, there are plenty of book stalls for sale and plenty of people to get to know each other, and you can ask questions of everyone. Marianne.
So we've got loads of books in Irish upstairs. We think we might be the only sort of public Irish language library in Belfast, and that's our charter. So do come up, we'll have the doors open, and we'd love you to visit.
Marianne puts me to shame. She has far more Irish than I do now, and she was inviting all of you to go up to see the library, the Irish library for the tourist project here at Skainos and East Belfast Mission, and their children's section now. So that's another thing you can do. So thanks for a wonderful morning. Thanks to our speakers now and all of you, and enjoy your lunch. Thanks very much, John and Anton.